Hi, I'm Rick Reef. Welcome to SoCal Insider. LA Mayor Eric Garcetti is settling into his job, and it's a daunting one. Scandals in several city departments, huge budget shortfalls, and enough other problems, traffic, blight, potholes, to make many people wonder if maybe it's time to press a reset button and reform city government. It's been done before, most recently under Mayor Richard Riordan 15 years ago. Well, the man who led that Charter Reform Commission, legal scholar Erwin Chemerinsky, will give his views on fixing LA. And we'll get the professor's take on a few other issues, including a court ruling that strikes down part of California's Victims' Rights Bill. Should prisoner rights trump the pain of victims and their families? But first, fuel cells. Well, they're not really new. The technology actually dates back over 150 years. But until now, they've been pretty much a hidden player on the energy scene. However, some folks are betting that will soon change. David Nazar, what's the story?
Rick, for all intents and purposes, fuel cells could be the way of the future, even while they're currently all around us. Although, as you mentioned, they're easily overlooked. Fuel cells provide backup power for all kinds of buildings like hospitals, schools, and stores, and they're found in everything from space vehicles and submarines to forklifts and buses. Now they're getting ready for the open road. Since the advent of the automobile, it's been one of America's favorite pastimes. Hopping in the hatchback and hitting the highway. Whether it's a drive along the coast or a cruise in the canyon, we kind of have a love affair with our cars. Or at least we did until urban sprawl and grisly gridlock pummeled California, resulting in decades of a smog-infested Southland. Most any Angelino who was around in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s remembers the dark soot as it blackened the sky all the way from downtown Los Angeles to Santa Monica Beach and beyond. Those giant automobiles with monster engines, carburetors, lead gasoline, and no catalytic converters were killing the environment. Auto exhaust was determined to be the major culprit. Something needed to be done. Then LA Supervisor Kenneth Hahn actually wrote to General Motors saying this can't continue. That's when Governor Pat Brown signed legislation that created the California Air Resources Board in the mid-60s. Finally, air pollution could be regulated in vehicles. Then in the mid-70s, the California legislature created a new regional agency, primarily because of the pollution generated by cars that had already infiltrated the Inland Empire. That agency was the AQMD. As the feds teamed with state and local regulators, automakers were already building smaller, more economical cars, ones that used less gasoline and were more efficient and less hazardous to the environment. However, that still wasn't enough. Eventually, there were carpool lanes where hybrid plug-ins could take advantage of the fast track, and then all electric cars. And yet, despite the transformation by the auto industry and the staunch efforts of regulatory agencies, the environment was and is a huge concern. Thus began the real implementation of fuel cell technology, although it had been around for a while. In this case, the car of the future, here today. The fuel cell car doesn't use gasoline and it doesn't pollute the air. In fact, it produces steam instead of exhaust. That mystery fuel is hydrogen. What makes a hydrogen car possible is the fuel cell device, which basically converts hydrogen to electricity, giving off only heat and water. And because it's non-polluting, hydrogen seems to be ideal for the 21st century. That's the belief of UC Irvine engineer Scott Samuelson. Professor Samuelson is the director of the National Fuel Cell Center at UCI. The center was established in 1998 by the U.S. Department of Energy and the California Energy Commission to help protect the environment. Today, part of the center's mission is to accelerate the development and deployment of fuel cell technology for the next generation.
If you really look at what the automobile industry is doing, they began looking at this technology in the late 1980s, primarily because of the question as to how much longer would petroleum be available. We then had in the 1990s the climate change recognition of it being potentially an issue that we needed to address. Also in the 1990s, we were not making the progress in improving urban air quality that we thought we might. Then in the 2000 era, we had 9/11, which then drove us to saying, well, we should be looking at fuel independence. All of these forcing functions have added credibility to this product that is now being deployed next year. And for all practical purposes, this is the business strategy for the automobile companies going forward of how they will stay in business, not only in California, not only in the United States, but around the world.
Companies like Toyota and Hyundai are looking to roll out the first fuel cell cars on their lots for consumer use at the end of 2014 or early 2015.
Fuel cell technology is going to be a necessary requirement for the environment going forward.
And that's part of the reason why hundreds of folks are gathered here today at UCI to share information and learn more about the latest in fuel cell cars and fuel cell technology. It's a packed house of researchers, scientists, manufacturers, stakeholders, and just plain old curious folk interested in this applied science. However, for all the proponents, there are just as many opponents. Critics of this scientific know-how say fuel cell technology is too new and there isn't sufficient infrastructure yet, such as enough hydrogen fueling stations or distribution channels to get hydrogen all over the country. Also, some opponents claim that hydrogen in itself causes pollution because they say it can be produced using coal, nuclear power, oil, or natural gas, all methods that can cause pollution such as carbon dioxide. And finally, the critics argue that technology is too expensive, not practical, and a huge waste of money that Uncle Sam, state governments, and local municipalities don't have to waste, especially in these tough economic times. Objectively looking at this, is the fuel cell technology a way of the future and a way to save the environment, or quite frankly, these days, is it a financial boondoggle?
You know, fuel cells are expensive today, but if you go beyond the financial aspect, the environment is saying we really have no choice. We really have to transition.
Mary Nichols is buying that argument. In fact, she's banking on it. Nichols is part of UCI's Fuel Cell Symposium. Nichols is the chair of the California Air Resources Board. She was appointed back in 1975 by Governor Jerry Brown when Brown was first elected.
It took a state agency to go after the auto industry, which was the major cause and still is. Transportation is our largest contributor to air pollution. It's our cars and trucks and what they burn. And so ARB's job is to try to bring levels of air pollution down to safe levels. But we now have the job of also dealing with global warming pollution. So that's been added just recently. Cars today with internal combustion engines are already 99% cleaner than they were just 20 or so years ago.
So who needs the fuel cell then? Why any of this technology to begin with?
Well, that's what the question is, really.
Nichols says she also has the answer.
We need advanced technology vehicles. We need the plug-in hybrids. We need battery electrics. We need cars that are running on very advanced biofuels. And we need the fuel cell vehicles to meet all of our transportation needs.
The issue of fuel cell technology has also morphed into a political battle. Some on the far right say nothing should change. Some on the far left say we shouldn't use another drop of petroleum. Nichols believes she again has the answer.
We have to break the link between burning fuel and running our economy. And this is one of the only ways we can do that is through a fuel cell, which doesn't burn anything.
And another sign that fuel cells might be catching on, well, Wall Street is getting interested. Rick, while at that symposium, I did have the chance to interview a fellow by the name of Chip Bottone. Bottone is the president and CEO of a company called Fuel Cell Energy. Now, Fuel Cell Energy is a publicly traded company on the NASDAQ for over 20 years. They design, manufacture, and install, and then operate their fuel cell power plants around the world. Bottone tells me there are only a few companies doing this type of business. Now, his is not yet profitable. However, Rick, Fuel Cell Energy does already employ 700 people around the globe, and his goal obviously is to make a few bucks and maybe even start a trend. Who knows?
Okay, you know, David, this symposium underscores a lot of the exciting things that are going on in Southern California. We have universities, we have entrepreneurs, the car companies themselves, a lot going on in research and development of the future cars. And during the Super Bowl, Bob Dylan did that commercial saying Detroit will, you know, let us build your car in Detroit. Actually, maybe we should get Jack Nicholson to do one that said, we'll build it in Southern California. When I hear a state official, though, like Mary Nichols, say that we've got to do all these things and kind of put the government stamp of approval on a certain technology, government hasn't had a good track record lately when it comes to green energy, picking the winners and losers. And as you reference in your report, the problem with fuel cells in the mind of a lot of people is it takes a lot of energy, and that we've got Tesla now. We've got these battery-operated cars. A lot of people are saying that's a much more advanced technology. If you're going to make hydrogen, instead of trying to cram it in these little fossil fuel cell cars. Why not just throw that energy into the grid and let people take their battery car and plug it in? And that, again, let these corporations and things, I guess I'm saying let the market kind of decide who's going to be the winner and loser and not have government pick them.
Well, in all honesty, it seems you might be wrong on this one, Rick. I mean, look, you've got to have some government regulations. These regulatory bodies, they were the ones that cleaned up the air in California. I mean, I was a kid here in the 70s and 80s. You couldn't breathe. You couldn't see 100 feet in front of you. If you lived in West LA, you couldn't see the mountains. You couldn't see downtown. I'm telling you, we would go home from school. You couldn't breathe. I mean, you were in so much pain from the smog. These regulatory agencies were the ones that said, you know what, we've got to get in here and fix this thing. And by the way, it just seems to me that as we go forward, as we try to protect the environment, there's nothing wrong with having a bevy of different things. Fuel cell cars, the hybrid plug-ins, the Teslas, all the above. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. I mean, what do you want us to be? China? I mean, they can't even see 10 feet in front of them.
No, but David, again, it's why can't government ever declare victory? By her own account, Mary Nichols said the cars now, those that are burning gasoline, are 99% better than they were. Is it really worth that extra 1% to take the absolutist position that I heard her saying that we've got to get off of fossil fuel? We can't burn, any fossil fuel at all. If we're already 99% there, the air is a lot cleaner. Might it not make sense to, go a little easier on this? All I'm saying is that whenever I hear a government official take an absolutist position, I worry that some bad policy is going to follow.
Well, look, the health of folks were at stake in Southern California decades ago, and we just don't want to go backwards. We don't want to go back to where we were. So again, it's just trying to be progressive in the sense that there are these options. Let's not go back to where we were.
No, I think we've taken 99 steps forward. I don't think we're going to take, one or two back. Anyways, thank you very much, David. And now, joining me to give his legal perspectives on the news, Dean of UC Irvine's Law School, Erwin Chemerinsky. Erwin, welcome back.
Such a pleasure to be with you.
All right, so now are you doing your part with the cars?
I drive a Prius.
All right, so you drove it over here today.
I did. It's in your parking lot right now.
All right. Now, of course, though, the Prius, that's a hybrid. That's fossil fuel. Yeah, I mean, you're burning some fossil fuel in that thing, right? So now when you get your new car, is it you're going to go battery or fuel cell, or haven't you decided?
Haven't made the decision, but here I've got to agree with what David says. We do have to find a way of decreasing the use of fossil fuels. Climate change is a real problem. Also, we need to have fuels that are much more ecologically compatible with especially a growing population.
Okay, well, I'm not going to debate you on that today, all right, because there's many other things. But, what have you been up to? I understand you just argued before the U.S. Supreme Court.
I did. I argued a case in December 4th in the Supreme Court. The case is called United States versus Appel, and it's about the right to protest just outside of Vandenberg Air Force Base. Pacific Coast Highway runs outside of the closed base. And the question is, does somebody have a right to stand on the public area of the Pacific Coast Highway and engage in protest activities?
Okay, and you argued on the side of the protesters, and how did you do?
Well, the Supreme Court said that the federal law that restricts protests applies to all of the land owned by the federal government, but the Supreme Court didn't reach the key First Amendment free speech question and sent that back to the Ninth Circuit.
So it sounds to me like you're in a lawyerly way saying you lost part of that argument.
I lost. There were two questions. Right. One is the interpretation of a federal statute. The other is a constitutional question. The court decided the statutory question against my client, but didn't reach the First Amendment issue. That's back in the Court of Appeals, and I'm very optimistic on that.
And being one of the most acclaimed legal scholars in the country, how many times have you argued before the Supreme Court?
This is my fifth argument in the Supreme Court.
That's like facing big league pitching, right? What's that like?
It's exciting because the justices are so well prepared. It's also frustrating because the justices have very little respect for one another's question. So you get a question from one person, you get one sentence, and then somebody else is asking you a question about something totally different. I had one thing, I really worked on my answer. I had it down to 3 sentences. Justice Breyer asked me the question. I was so well prepared. I got the first sentence out, and then somebody asked me a question about something else. I never got back to the latter 2 sentences. So it's exhilarating, but it's also frustrating.
It's kind of scary. A guy like Scalia, is he kind of scary,
Well, at one point, he was asking me about the First Amendment issue, and I was explaining why it was properly before the court. And his response to me was, and I will quote, but we don't have to listen to you. There's no response when a justice says that
You
to
say,
you.
yes, sir. Okay. All right. Let's talk about Los Angeles. Got a new mayor, lots of problems in LA. Some people are saying it's time maybe for another commission, time to really redo government. You were involved in that process. What do you think?
In 1997, I was elected by Los Angeles voters to a 15-person commission to rewrite the city charter. We spent 2 years on the process. There was another commission appointed by the city council doing the same thing. We put forth a proposal. It was adopted by the voters in June 1999. We're only 15 years into the history of this charter. I don't think we need another charter reform commission. I think the real question is, are large cities the size of Los Angeles even governable in a meaningful way?
Okay. And what's your answer to that?
I don't think we know. When you look at cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, they all face so many similar problems. Among the problems are they don't have enough money to provide basic services. And I think one of the questions that our country faces are the taxpayers willing to pay enough to, as you say, fill the potholes, provide for decent schools?
Oh, but again, though, a lot of the spending now doesn't, the extra dollar that comes in doesn't go for services. It's going for public employee pensions. It's going for these unfunded liabilities, which continue to grow. Don't you need reform? Is it enough to just say people need to pay more? Don't there have to be some fundamental reforms of how money is spent?
The reality is Los Angeles doesn't have enough money to fill the potholes. And the problems that Los Angeles is facing are similar in other cities. We can talk about what can be done with regard to pension reform. Of course, the pensions that are there as a result of the city negotiating with the unions to provide these benefits. There are constitutional limits on being able to change them retroactively. But I also believe that we as a society, and this is a much more general point, face the question of, will we provide the resources for the basic services that we need from government?
Well, again, let's go back to the pensions and the legal issue. You brought up the courts have pretty much said you've got to pay this. One way not to pay it is to go broke, go into bankruptcy court and maybe get out of it that way. From a policy standpoint, isn't that an awful way to deal with things?
Of course, a city's bankruptcy is an awful way to deal with things. I also think that you're exaggerating the effects of pensions on city revenues. The problems of cities aren't just about the amount of pensions that go to public workers. The problem with cities are they don't have enough revenues to provide basic services. Here in California, Prop 13 had many benefits in limiting property taxes, but it's also limited local governments in their ability to have the dollars they need to provide essential services, emergency services, police services, fire services, as well as just maintaining the roads.
Very good. Let's move on to another issue, which is Marsy's Law. That's the state's Victims' Bill of Rights. A federal judge just made a ruling that some people think was placing the rights of prisoners over the concerns of victims. Talk a little bit about Marsy's Law and this ruling.
Marsy's Law was an initiative passed by the voters in 2008. It has 17 provisions meant to increase the rights of victims. For example, it gives victims the right to be heard in sentencing procedures. It gives victims the right to be notified before somebody who's been convicted of a crime is released. The specific ruling you're talking about is Marsy's Law said that nobody has to be given a parole hearing more than every 3 years. And that's protective of families. It's wrenching for families to have to testify against someone's parole, to have to relive the horrible experience that a loved one suffered. But what Judge Carlton in Sacramento said is you can't apply that retroactively to people who were convicted before 2008. That would be an ex post facto law. It would be changing the punishment for crime after someone was convicted.
Well, let me ask you, though, is parole a right? In other words, is a parole hearing a right? Why not change the law and say, hey, it'd be nice, to have parole every year, but we're going to give it to you every 4 years. You're sentenced to a term. Is it a right? Is parole a right?
There is no constitutional right to parole, but a statute can create what's called a liberty interest in parole. So if the government wanted to say no parole in the future, that's the government's prerogative. But if somebody was convicted of a crime at a time that parole existed, to then eliminate parole is taking away a right, not that the Constitution gave them, but that the law gave them. And what Judge Carlton is saying is, it's fine for Marsy's Law to change the schedule for parole hearings in the future, but you can't do it retroactively for those who have already been convicted.
Okay, now the ruling, it was a 2-to-1 decision, right?
No, it's just one federal district court judge in
one
Sacramento.
federal judge. Okay, it likely to be appealed by those who don't like the ruling. Do you have a sense of, is it kind of a toss-up how this is going to wind up?
I think his ruling is very narrow. It's just for those who were convicted before 2008, and it just says they have to have the parole hearing every year that previously could expected. It's important to recognize that the other 16 provisions of Marcy's law are not affected, and they all remain in operation.
We should say Marcy's law was really championed by an entrepreneur, billionaire here, Henry Nicholas of Broadcom, who's given a lot to UC Irvine, I believe.
And his sister Marcy was very tragically murdered by an ex-boyfriend, and Marcy's law is named after her.
Right. And do you think, though, as we look at things, is the law leaning too much on the side of criminals and not enough on the side of victims?
That's such a hard question to answer in the abstract. When we talk about criminal defendants' rights, there's no power that the state possesses that's greater than to take away a person's liberty or even their life. And so the philosophy of our justice system has always been better to let 100 guilty people go free than to imprison one innocent person.
But these are guilty people.
Well, and we should also protect the rights of victims. And I think some of the provisions of Marcy's law are an important advance, letting, for example, those who have been affected by a crime know before a criminal is released from prison. I think that's basic decency, and that's what Marcy's law provides.
Okay. Finally, there's this case in Arizona. The governor, Jan Brewer, vetoed a bill that would basically have given a right to discriminate against gays, if you will. That's the way I think most critics of the law interpreted it. We had a case recently in Big Bear where a wedding caterer, didn't want to cater a gay wedding, and I think the gay couple there decided to just drop it. And I think in New Mexico, it's actually it's a case that's being tried. We're going to hear this case, so it's one thing to say you shouldn't discriminate. What about the person that, for religious reasons, just doesn't want to do a gay wedding?
First, the Arizona bill, which Governor Brewer vetoed, would have allowed anyone to discriminate on the basis of religion on any ground. So a person could discriminate based on race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. It wasn't just about sexual orientation. Second, I don't believe that somebody's religion ever gives them a right to harm others. A racist can't say that race discrimination is part of his or her religion. Somebody who's misogynist can't say that gender discrimination is part of my religion. Nor do I believe that somebody can say, I'm going to discriminate based on sexual orientation, based on my religion. If your religion says that same-sex marriage is wrong, then don't marry someone of the same sex. But it doesn't violate your religion to take photographs of a same-sex wedding. It doesn't violate your religion to cater a same-sex wedding.
Okay, well, I wish we could discuss this a little more. We are out of time. Erwin, always great to have you on. Thanks so much.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
You can watch this show and past shows at rickreef.com. Segments of the show can also be viewed at pbssocal.org. My guest has been Erwin Chemerinsky. And a special thanks to Scott Samuelson and Mary Nichols. And thank you for watching. We'll see you again on SoCal Insider.
SoCal Insider with Rick Reef is brought to you by the following. 5 Point Communities is a proud sponsor of PBS SoCal. 5 Point Communities is an independent real estate development company with assets under management across California. More information available at www.fivepointcommunities.com. Snell & Wilmer is a full-service business law firm with more than 400 attorneys in Orange County, Los Angeles, and throughout the West. On the web at swlaw.com. Snell & Wilmer. Straight talk, sound counsel. Practical solutions.
Relief Pod's latest generation of safety kits now go everywhere you go. Relief Pod's organized, color-coded, and compact safety kits keep first aid and emergency items accessible for a safe lifestyle every day. Relief Pod. Live ready.
A healthy future for you, your family, and your business is why Memorial Care Health System transformed healthcare. Our hospitals, physicians, and outpatient centers keep patients healthy and care for them when they're not. Memorial Care, one healthcare system leading the way.
Stem cells are showing great promise for the treatment of disease and injury. At UC Irvine, innovations in stem cell research are rapidly moving potential therapies from the lab to the patient.